The morning sun streamed through the airport terminal windows as a well-dressed gentleman in his mid-40s walked briskly toward his gate. He'd swapped his usual surgical scrubs for comfortable traveling clothes, a soft navy sweater, and dark jeans. His carry-on bag was heavy with medical journals and a laptop, tools he'd need to review his upcoming surgery during the flight. As one of the country's top neurosurgeons, he was used to these last-minute flights. This time, a diplomatic family's young child needed his expertise for a delicate brain procedure. The surgery was scheduled for early tomorrow morning in Chicago, and there wasn't a moment to waste. He'd been up since 4 a.m., completing his rounds at his home hospital before rushing to catch this flight. The exhaustion showed in his eyes, but his movements remained purposeful. He grabbed a quick coffee from the airport cafe, its warmth providing a much-needed boost as he navigated the busy terminal. At the gate, he smiled warmly at the boarding agent while presenting his first-class ticket. Years of success in his field had earned him these small comforts, though today it wasn't about luxury. Every minute of rest would help him stay sharp for tomorrow's operation. Walking down the jet bridge, he mentally reviewed the child's case files he'd studied the night before. The complexity of the surgery ahead occupied his thoughts as he found his seat, 3A, by the window. He carefully stored his carry-on in the overhead compartment, keeping his medical bag at his feet where he could easily access his phone to check for any updates from the Chicago hospital team. The familiar announcements echoed through the cabin as other passengers boarded. A flight attendant offered him a pre-takeoff beverage, which he politely declined, instead pulling out his phone to send one last message to his surgical team about the preparations needed for tomorrow. As he settled into his seat, he couldn't help but notice a few passengers giving him strange looks. He was used to it. Being one of the few black doctors in his field often drew attention, though he never let it bother him. His mind was focused on more important things: the intricate procedure ahead, the nervous parents waiting in Chicago, and most importantly, the young child whose life would soon be in his skilled hands. He pulled out a medical journal from his bag, planning to review some recent research about the specific procedure he'd be performing. The cabin crew began their final preparations for takeoff, and he looked out the window, watching the ground crew complete their tasks. In just a few hours, he'd be in Chicago, ready to do what he did best: save lives. Little did he know that his ordinary business trip was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would expose deep-seated prejudices and challenge everyone involved to confront their own biases. For now, though, he was just another passenger, a highly skilled doctor on his way to help someone in need, unaware that his next few hours would become a story that would resonate with people across the nation. The trouble started with something as simple as reaching for his phone. The doctor had just received a vibrating notification, probably an important update about tomorrow's surgery. As he leaned down to get his phone from his medical bag, he noticed a woman in the row across from him tensing up. He'd seen that look before: the slight widening of eyes, the subtle shift away, the quick glance to nearby passengers. After 20 years in medicine, he'd learned to brush off these small moments of prejudice. His patients' lives meant more to him than these brief encounters with bias. The woman, clutching her designer purse tightly, kept stealing glances at him. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped nervously against her armrest. When he pulled out his phone to check the message, she flinched visibly, as if his normal movement somehow posed a threat. A young flight attendant walked past, and the woman quickly grabbed her arm. "Miss," she whispered, but loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear, "I need to speak with you privately." Her voice trembled with unnecessary fear, making other passengers turn their heads. The doctor pretended not to notice, keeping his eyes fixed on his phone screen. The message was indeed important. The Chicago hospital team needed to know which surgical tools to prepare specially for tomorrow's complex procedure. As he typed his response, he could see the flight attendant and the nervous passenger having a hushed conversation at the front of the first-class cabin. More eyes turned his way. A businessman across the aisle now watched him intently over his laptop. A couple in the row behind him fell silent mid-conversation. The atmosphere in the cabin grew thick with tension, all because one passenger had let her prejudices turn an ordinary situation into something it wasn't. The doctor continued reviewing his medical notes, trying to maintain his focus. Years of performing delicate brain surgeries had taught him to stay calm under pressure. Still, he couldn't help but feel a familiar weight in his chest, the burden of being judged not by his actions or achievements, but by biased assumptions about his appearance. He noticed more flight attendants gathering near the front of the plane, occasionally glancing in his direction. Their whispered conversations and concerned looks told him everything he needed to know. He'd been in similar situations before, at high-end restaurants, in hotel lobbies, even at medical conferences where people assumed he was part of the cleaning staff rather than a keynote speaker. Taking a deep breath, he saved his medical notes and put his phone away. Through the window, he could see they were still at the gate, though they should have started taxiing by now. Something was definitely brewing, and he had a sinking feeling about what was coming next. He thought about the young patient waiting for him in Chicago. The child's parents had specifically requested him, having heard about his exceptional track record with complex pediatric cases. Every minute of delay could impact tomorrow's carefully planned surgery schedule. The cabin had grown oddly quiet now, with only the hum of the air conditioning filling the space. He could feel the weight of stares from other passengers, some curious, others suspicious, a few seemingly embarrassed by what was unfolding. What should have been a routine flight was about to become something much more complicated, all because someone saw a threat where there was only a dedicated doctor trying to do his job. As he saw two air marshals making their way down the aisle, he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. Whatever happened next, he needed to stay professional and calm. Lives depended on him making it to Chicago, and he wasn't about to let unfounded fears and prejudices stand in the way of saving a child's life. The two air marshals approached with stern faces, their badges gleaming under the cabin lights. The taller one spoke first, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, we need you to come with us." The doctor looked up calmly, though his heart was racing. He'd spent years in operating rooms handling life or death situations, but this was different. "Is there a problem?" he asked quietly, conscious of the other passengers watching the scene unfold. His hands remained visible on his armrests, a habit he'd learned over years of dealing with similar situations. The shorter air marshal's hand rested near his hip, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the doctor. "Please gather your belongings and come with us," the taller marshal repeated, ignoring the question. The doctor reached slowly for his medical bag, explaining as he moved, "I'm a neurosurgeon headed to Chicago for an emergency surgery tomorrow morning. I can show you my medical credentials." As he carefully opened his bag, the shorter marshal stepped forward tensely. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them." The doctor froze, then slowly raised his hands. "My hospital ID and medical license are in the front pocket," he said steadily. "You can check them yourselves." A few rows back, someone was recording with their phone. The doctor could hear whispers rippling through the cabin. Some passengers looked uncomfortable, others seemed to be purposely looking away, and a few were watching with obvious concern. "I have a young patient waiting for me in Chicago," the doctor continued, his professional calm masking his growing worry about the delay. "Their surgery is scheduled for first thing tomorrow morning. It's a complex procedure that—" "Sir, we can discuss this off the aircraft," the taller marshal cut him off. Their tone made it clear they weren't interested in explanations. The doctor noticed how they kept their hands near their weapons, treating him like a threat despite his calm demeanor and professional explanation. Carefully standing up, the doctor remembered the countless times he faced similar prejudices. At luxury hotels where staff assumed he wasn't a guest. At medical conferences where people mistook him for support staff instead of the keynote speaker. But this time, a child's life hung in the balance. "Can I at least make a quick call to the hospital in Chicago?" he asked, reaching for his phone. They need to know if there's going to be a delay. The marshals exchanged glances. Phone away, sir. Now. Their voices had grown harder, more demanding. The nervous passenger who had started all this was watching wide-eyed, her hand still clutching her purse. The doctor caught her gaze for a moment, saw the flicker of doubt cross her face as she watched him handle the situation with dignity. As they escorted him down the aisle, he walked with his head held high, the same way he carried himself into every surgery. Some passengers couldn't meet his eyes. Others looked on with clear disapproval, though whether at him or the situation wasn't clear. Just before reaching the exit, he tried one last time. Please, just check my credentials. I'm supposed to perform brain surgery on a 5-year-old tomorrow morning. His voice carried the weight of responsibility, not just for his patient, but for every person who would face similar treatment because of their skin color. The flight attendant who had taken the initial complaint now stood by the door, her face showing signs of uncertainty as she watched the dignified doctor being led off the plane. The magnitude of what was happening seemed to be dawning on her, but it was too late. As they stepped into the jet bridge, the doctor could hear the murmur of conversations resuming behind him. He thought about his young patient in Chicago, about the worried parents who had specifically requested him for this delicate procedure. Time was ticking away, and somewhere in Chicago, a family was counting on him, unaware that their trusted doctor was being marched off a plane simply because someone's unfounded fears had been treated as facts. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal felt harsh after the dim cabin lighting. The doctor walked between the two air marshals, his medical bag still in hand, watching precious minutes tick away on the terminal's large clock. His professional composure was beginning to crack, not from fear or anger, but from genuine concern for his patient. Listen, he said, stopping near a row of empty seats. There's a 5-year-old child in Chicago who needs this surgery. Every minute we waste here puts them at risk. His voice carried the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. The taller marshal's expression softened slightly, but his partner remained stone-faced. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered at a distance, some openly filming with their phones. The doctor ignored them, focusing instead on reaching into his jacket pocket. Here's my business card, he said slowly, using the same steady hands that had performed countless delicate surgeries. Call the hospital. They're expecting me first thing tomorrow morning. The shorter marshal took the card, but didn't look at it. Sir, we need to follow protocol. The doctor felt his patience wearing thin, not for himself, but for his patient. Years of training had taught him that time was crucial in medical emergencies. He glanced at his watch again. The surgery prep team in Chicago would be wondering why he hadn't sent his usual update. Protocol. The doctor's voice finally showed a hint of frustration. What protocol requires you to remove a certified neurosurgeon from a flight without even checking his credentials? A few nearby passengers stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The Chicago hospital was calling. The doctor looked at the marshals, his eyes pleading. That's the hospital. Please, let me answer it. The taller marshal hesitated, then nodded slightly. The doctor quickly pulled out his phone, putting it on speaker to show he had nothing to hide. Doctor? A worried voice came through the speaker. We haven't received your pre-surgery protocol confirmation. Is everything all right? The doctor took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm currently being detained at the airport. Someone reported me as suspicious, and I've been removed from my flight. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Then the voice returned, sharper now. You're being what? The doctor could hear the disbelief in his colleague's tone. The head of pediatric neurosurgery, the doctor we specifically flew in for this emergency case, is being detained. The marshals exchanged uncomfortable glances as the voice continued. Do you realize this doctor is one of the top pediatric neurosurgeons in the country? He's scheduled to perform life-saving surgery tomorrow morning on a diplomat's child. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted. Nearby passengers who had been watching began whispering among themselves. The doctor could see realization and embarrassment dawning on some faces. One of the flight attendants who had followed them into the terminal was now on her phone, speaking urgently to someone. The doctor's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the situation finally showing in his posture. He wasn't thinking about the injustice he was facing or the humiliation of being marched through the airport. His mind was on that 5-year-old child in Chicago, whose parents had put their trust in him. The family specifically requested me for this surgery, he explained quietly to the marshals, his voice heavy with responsibility. They've already waited longer than they should have because of the complexity of the case. Every delay. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The taller marshal was now actually looking at the business card, his expression changing as he read the impressive credentials. The shorter one was speaking rapidly into his radio, likely conferring with superiors about how to handle this increasingly complicated situation. Through the terminal windows, the doctor could see his flight still waiting at the gate. Time was slipping away, and somewhere in Chicago, a family was counting on him. The dignity and calm he'd maintained were starting to show cracks, not from anger at his treatment, but from the crushing weight of knowing a young patient's life hung in the balance while he stood here, a victim of someone's unfounded fears. The terminal erupted into sudden activity when the chief of surgery's voice boomed through the phone speaker. The airline manager, a man in his 50s wearing a crisp suit, came rushing down the terminal, his face flushed from both running and embarrassment. Behind him, several other airline officials hurried to keep up. "I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding, Doctor," the manager said, slightly out of breath. His eyes darted nervously between the doctor and the air marshals. The phone was still on speaker, and the chief of surgery wasn't finished speaking. "Do you realize," the voice continued, "that this doctor pioneered a surgical technique that saved hundreds of children's lives? He's scheduled to perform that same procedure tomorrow morning on a 5-year-old who's been waiting for weeks to see him." The shorter air marshal had completely dropped his stern demeanor now, looking thoroughly uncomfortable. The taller one was frantically scanning through something on his phone, probably looking up the doctor's credentials that they should have checked in the first place. A small crowd had gathered in the terminal, many with phones recording the scene. The doctor noticed how quickly people's expressions had changed, from suspicion to shock, from fear to shame. The same faces that had watched him being escorted off the plane now showed embarrassment and regret. The nervous passenger who had reported him was standing at the edge of the crowd, her face pale. She kept opening her mouth as if to say something, then closing it again. The flight attendant who had taken her complaint stood beside her, looking equally mortified. "I've got the hospital commissioner on another line," the airline manager said, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, sir. Yes, we understand the gravity. Absolutely, sir." He turned to the doctor, sweat visible on his forehead. "We'll get you on the next flight to Chicago immediately. First class, of course." The doctor checked his watch again. Precious minutes had ticked by. "The next flight won't get me there in time for pre-surgery preparations," he said, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge about what this delay meant. "I need to be on this flight." The airline manager nodded vigorously. "We'll get you back on your original flight right away." He turned to his staff, snapping his fingers. "Clear the jet bridge immediately. Priority boarding for the doctor." The air marshals, who moments ago had been treating him like a threat, now couldn't meet his eyes. One of them awkwardly offered to carry his medical bag. The doctor declined politely, holding onto the bag that contained vital information about tomorrow's surgery. As they walked back toward the plane, the doctor could hear snippets of conversations from the crowd. "That's the doctor who developed that new children's surgery. Can't believe they just assumed. Someone almost died because of prejudice." The airline manager was still apologizing profusely, offering everything from free flights to airport lounge access. But the doctor wasn't listening. His mind was already in Chicago, reviewing the surgical procedures he'd need to perform to save his young patient's life. Just before boarding, he turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice calm but firm. I hope everyone here remembers this moment. Because somewhere, right now, there's another black professional being judged by their appearance rather than their credentials. And maybe they don't have a chief of surgery to call and verify their importance. Maybe they're just regular people, deserving the same respect I had to prove I earned. The terminal fell silent. Even the airline manager stopped mid-apology. The weight of the doctor's words hung in the air, making everyone present confront their own biases and assumptions. As he walked back onto the plane, the other passengers avoided eye contact, some from shame, others from embarrassment at what they had witnessed. The doctor settled back into his first-class seat, pulled out his medical documents, and resumed preparing for tomorrow's surgery, just as he'd been doing before prejudice and fear had interrupted his journey. Back on the plane, the atmosphere had completely changed. Flight attendants who had earlier viewed him with suspicion now hovered anxiously, offering everything from premium headphones to extra pillows. The doctor politely declined each offer, focused instead on reviewing his surgical notes for tomorrow's procedure. The airline's customer service director had boarded the plane personally, clutching a leather folder filled with documents. Doctor, we've arranged for a private car to meet you at O'Hare Airport, she said, her voice carrying a mix of professional courtesy and personal shame. It will take you directly to the hospital. A flight attendant appeared with a fresh cup of coffee, the expensive kind usually reserved for international first-class passengers. It's the least we can do, she said softly, placing it carefully on his tray table. The doctor thanked her with a gentle smile, though his mind was already back on his young patient's case. The nervous passenger who had reported him was now sitting quietly in her seat, staring straight ahead. Her earlier fear had been replaced by visible embarrassment. Several times she glanced over as if wanting to apologize, but couldn't find the courage to speak. The customer service director was still talking. We've also arranged for hotel accommodation near the hospital, though I understand you'll likely be there all night preparing. Her voice trailed off as she realized she was interrupting his concentration on medical documents. Through the window, the doctor could see ground crew members rushing to finish their tasks. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the delay and promising to make up time in the air. What went unspoken was the reason for that delay, an incident that had exposed deep-seated prejudices in everyday life. Other passengers were boarding again, many doing double takes as they passed his seat. Some had been filming earlier and were now probably sharing those videos online. The doctor kept his focus on his medical files, knowing that by tomorrow, this incident would likely be viral on social media. The businessmen across the aisle, who had earlier watched him suspiciously, now tried to start a conversation. I hear you're performing groundbreaking surgery tomorrow. The doctor nodded politely, but kept his responses brief. His priority wasn't explaining himself to people who had prejudged him. It was preparing for tomorrow's delicate procedure. A young girl walking down the aisle with her mother pointed at him and whispered something. The mother quickly shushed her, looking embarrassed. The doctor caught fragments of conversations as people settled into their seats. Can't believe we almost prevented. What if the child had? Should be ashamed of ourselves. The airline staff continued their parade of apologies and offers. Upgraded frequent flyer status, unlimited lounge access, priority boarding for life. The doctor acknowledged each offer with a quiet thank you, but his attention remained on his medical papers. In his mind, he was already in the operating room, visualizing each critical step of tomorrow's surgery. The pilot made one final announcement about departure, and the plane finally began to push back from the gate. As they taxied toward the runway, the doctor felt his phone buzz with messages. News of the incident was spreading through medical circles. His colleagues were expressing outrage, support, and concern for tomorrow's patient. Looking out the window at the airport lights growing distant, the doctor reflected on how quickly people's attitudes had shifted. The same individuals who had seen him as a threat were now treating him like a celebrity. But he hadn't changed. Only their perception had. He was the same dedicated surgeon he'd been an hour ago. The same professional he'd been his entire career. As the plane lifted off, he returned to reviewing his surgical plans, knowing that tomorrow, none of this would matter. In the operating room, he wouldn't be the black doctor who was profiled on a plane. He would simply be the surgeon, focused on saving a young life, just as he'd always been. News of the incident spread like wildfire across social media before the plane even landed in Chicago. Passengers' videos had already gone viral, showing the respected neurosurgeon being escorted off the plane. The hashtag Dr. Wildark was trending, bringing attention to a problem many professionals of color face daily. During the flight, the doctor's phone had been buzzing constantly with notifications. Fellow surgeons, medical associations, and civil rights groups were all reaching out. But he kept his phone in airplane mode, focusing instead on tomorrow's surgery. The young patient's life mattered more to him than any social media storm. Major news networks picked up the story quickly. Their headlines varied. Top neurosurgeon profiled on flight to emergency surgery. Child's life-saving surgery delayed by racial profiling. Airline faces backlash after removing renowned doctor. The airline's PR team was in crisis mode. They released statement after statement, each one carefully worded. We deeply regret the incident. Committed to diversity and inclusion. Taking immediate steps to review our protocols. But the public wasn't buying it. Their social media pages were flooded with angry comments and calls for boycotts. In the middle of this growing storm, the doctor remained calm and focused. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, he was still reviewing surgical notes, marking important points for his team. A flight attendant who'd been checking social media approached him hesitantly. "Doctor, you're trending on every platform," she said softly. "People are really angry about what happened to you." He looked up briefly from his medical papers. "I hope they're angry enough to change," he replied quietly, before returning to his preparation work. The videos showed different angles of the incident. Some captured the moment the air marshals approached him. Others showed his dignified response. But the clip that really caught fire was his final statement in the terminal about other black professionals facing similar prejudice without his credentials to protect them. Comments poured in from around the country. "This happened to my brother, a corporate lawyer, last month. I'm a black doctor too. We all have stories like this. When will this stop? How many more professionals need to be humiliated?" Civil rights leaders were already scheduling press conferences. Medical associations released statements supporting their colleague and condemning the incident. Hospital administrators across the country began sharing their own stories of similar experiences. The nervous passenger who had started it all was identified in some videos, though most people chose not to share her information. Instead, they used her actions to spark important conversations about implicit bias and its real-world consequences. As the plane touched down in Chicago, the flight crew made an unusual announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for our earlier actions toward one of our most distinguished passengers. We hope his example of grace under pressure serves as a lesson to us all." Several passengers tried to approach the doctor to express their support or apologize, but his mind was elsewhere. In just a few hours, he would be in the operating room, doing what he did best, saving lives. That's what mattered to him, not the viral videos or trending hashtags. The ground crew had a priority vehicle waiting at the gate. As the doctor gathered his medical bag, passengers began to applaud, not for his celebrity status or viral fame, but for his unwavering dedication to his patient despite everything he'd endured. Stepping off the plane, he could see news cameras already gathering at the terminal. But he would exit through a private entrance. His young patient was waiting, and no amount of media attention would distract him from his true purpose, being the skilled surgeon his patients needed him to be. The hospital corridors were quiet in the early morning hours as the doctor changed into his surgical scrubs. His hands, the same ones that had been forced into the air just hours ago, now moved with practiced precision as he scrubbed in for surgery. The events on the plane felt like a distant memory as he focused on the task ahead. The surgical team was already prepped and waiting. They'd all seen the viral videos, but no one mentioned them. Instead, they discussed the complex procedure ahead. The doctor led them through the surgical plan with his usual calm authority. This was his element, where expertise mattered more than appearance. In the waiting room, the young patient's parents sat anxiously. They had no idea about the incident that had almost prevented their child's surgery. To them, the doctor was simply the best pediatric neurosurgeon available, the one who had given them hope when other doctors had turned away. The procedure will take approximately 6 hours, the doctor explained to them during his pre-surgery visit. The mother grabbed his hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for being here," she said. The doctor gave her a reassuring smile, choosing not to share how close he'd come to missing this moment. The operating room was bright and sterile, medical instruments laid out with perfect precision. The anesthesiologist reported the patient's vital signs, all stable. The young child lay peacefully on the operating table, unaware of both the complexity of the surgery ahead and the social storm that had nearly delayed it. As he'd done countless times before, the doctor took a deep breath before making the first incision. The surgical team worked in perfect harmony, each person knowing their role. Hours passed without anyone noticing, their complete focus on the delicate procedure taking place. Through the observation window, other doctors and medical students watched in admiration. Word had spread through the hospital about the incident on the plane, making this surgery even more poignant. They watched as those steady hands carefully navigated the intricate pathways of the brain, years of training evident in every precise movement. Halfway through the surgery, a nurse noticed the doctor had been standing in the same position for 3 hours straight. "Doctor, would you like to take a brief break?" she whispered. He shook his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the surgical site. His dedication to his patient trumped any physical discomfort. The procedure was groundbreaking, a technique the doctor himself had developed. As he worked, he quietly explained each step to the attending residents. Even in the middle of such a complex surgery, he remained committed to teaching the next generation of surgeons. Outside the operating room, life went on. News channels were still running the story of his airport ordeal. Social media continued to buzz with debate and discussion. But inside these walls, none of that mattered. Here, he was simply a surgeon doing what he trained his entire life to do. 5 hours into the surgery, a critical moment arrived. The whole team held their breath as the doctor navigated the most delicate part of the procedure. His hands moved with incredible precision, showing no signs of fatigue from his stressful journey or sleepless night. The final hour of surgery was intense but controlled. Every movement was calculated, every decision measured. The doctor's focus never wavered. This was why he had fought so hard to make this flight. This moment, this child, this chance to make a difference. As he placed the final suture, the tension in the room lifted. The procedure had been successful. The surgical team exchanged quiet smiles, knowing they had just witnessed something special, not just a masterful surgery, but a testament to perseverance and professionalism in the face of prejudice. Looking at his young 2 weeks after the incident, the doctor sat in his office, reading through a stack of letters. They had poured in from around the country. Messages of support from other medical professionals, apologies from airline staff, and thank you notes from parents whose children he had treated over the years. The airline was facing serious consequences. Their stock prices had dropped, and they'd lost several major corporate contracts. In response, they announced mandatory sensitivity training for all employees and hired diversity consultants to review their policies. The nervous passenger who had reported him had publicly apologized through her lawyer, saying the incident had forced her to confront her own biases. But the most meaningful letter on his desk came from his young patient's parents. Their child was recovering beautifully, already back home and showing remarkable progress. "You didn't just save our child's life," they wrote. You showed the world what real dignity looks like. The hospital had received hundreds of calls from black medical students across the country. Many shared how the incident had affected them. Some had faced similar prejudices during their training, others worried about their future experiences. The doctor decided to start a mentorship program, turning his experience into an opportunity to support the next generation. Major medical conferences began inviting him to speak not just about his groundbreaking surgical techniques, but about his experience as a black professional in medicine. He accepted some invitations, always steering the conversation back to patient care and the importance of looking past appearances to see expertise. The air marshals who had escorted him off the plane requested to meet him. They came to his office, badges tucked away, looking more human than authoritative now. "We've been doing this job for years," the taller one said, "but that day changed how we look at every situation." The doctor appreciated their honesty, but reminded them that change needed to go beyond just one incident. Several airlines reached out to him, asking him to consult on their diversity training programs. He agreed, but with one condition: that they focused not just on high-profile professionals like himself, but on treating every passenger with equal respect and dignity. One morning, he received a call from a young black doctor in another state. "I was almost ready to quit medicine after years of being doubted and second-guessed," she told him. "But seeing how you handled that situation gave me strength to continue." These were the calls that meant the most to him. The videos of the incident became part of training materials at police academies and customer service programs. Not because the doctor had fought back or made a scene, but because his calm dignity in the face of prejudice spoke louder than any angry response could have. His young patient had a follow-up appointment 6 weeks after the surgery. As the child played happily in the exam room, showing no signs of their previous condition, the doctor reflected on how close prejudice had come to preventing this outcome. The child's laughter was the best response to ignorance you could imagine. During hospital rounds, new patients often recognized him from the news, but he never brought up the incident himself. Instead, he focused on their care, showing through his actions that a doctor's skill and dedication matter more than their appearance. The final change came quietly. The airline industry, facing pressure from multiple directions, revised its security protocols. Now, passenger concerns had to be evaluated based on specific behaviors, not vague feelings or biases. It was a small step, but an important one. In his final interview about the incident, a reporter asked what message he had for others facing similar prejudice. The doctor thought about it carefully before responding. "Excellence is the best answer to ignorance. Keep pushing forward, keep doing what you do best. Change comes not just from confronting wrongs, but from consistently proving them wrong through our actions." Looking out his office window at the hospital where he had performed countless successful surgeries, the doctor smiled. The incident had sparked important conversations about bias in America, but for him, the most important outcome was simple. His patients were getting better, and that's all that had ever mattered to him.